I'm Francis Levy, co-director of the Philip Setzer Center. Dr. Edward Dessessian is the other co-director. And welcome to Music and Imagination, Finding Consensus in the Emerson String Quartet. Now, the art you see on the wall is self-reflection, the true mirror. And if you go into our annex next door, we have a true mirror, which when you look into this object, you will see yourself as other people see you. So I will not say the joke. Can I say the fact that when I tried it, I didn't see anything different? Anyway, one other thing I wanted to say is that all Philip Setzer events, people have been someone came in tonight and said, well, what happened with the Philip Larkin poetry event last week where Andrew Motion spoke? I said, well, I'm sorry you missed. She thought she was coming tonight for that, but actually she can see it by going to www.philipsetzer.org and simply going to past programs. You can see all of our programs. And our programs are also simulcast. We want to encourage you to come to the Philip Setzer Center, but if you can't come to the Philip Setzer Center, then you can watch it on your computer. So now I'm very pleased to present Stephanie Chase. Stephanie Chase is a violinist who has performed as a soloist with many of the world's leading orchestras, including the New York Philharmonic, the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, the London Symphony Orchestra. And you're also going to be performing at Carnegie Hall at the end of May, did you say?
Yes, yes.
And it's
at the end of next month.
The Children's, do you want to say?
Children's Orchestra Society, and I'm playing Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto as their soloist. So it's May 29th at Carnegie Hall on the big stage, and I'm excited about it.
She's also the founder of the Music of the Sphere Society, which is dedicated to exploring the links between music, philosophy, and the sciences. She teaches violin at New York University's Steinhardt School. In her spare time, she writes music arrangements and studies Stradivari violins. In late May 2008, she will perform one of her signature works, Tchaikovsky's Violin Concerto, at this particular... No.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, you got it. Thank you. Got it twice.
In Stern Auditorium. Stephanie Chase will moderate tonight's panel and introduce our other distinguished guests. So take it away,
so
Stephanie.
much. Thank you. Thank you for coming. Welcome. And pardon my back, some of you. I'll turn around periodically to try to catch some of you. In putting together tonight's program, I thought it might be very interesting to explore interpretation of music from a collaborative foundation, in other words, a string quartet. And so I began thinking of, well, what string quartet members could I come up with? And Philip Setzer was the person I wanted the most. And we are so fortunate that he was able to join us tonight. He's been rehearsing all day. He's getting ready to record Schubert trios with one of his colleagues, David Finkel, and David's wife, Wu Han, who's a wonderful pianist. They're also the co-directors now at Lincoln Center Chamber Music Society, yes? And so I thought, what better person to ask about this? Because this, to me, is a very interesting process. In fact, a number of years ago, there was a movie that came out. It didn't have a lot of showings, wide viewership of it, but I think it was called High Fidelity. Did you ever see that? On the Guarneri Quartet? And it was very revealing because it really showed a lot about how they worked together, but also how they lived or didn't live together and traveled separately and wanted to stay on different hotel floors and take different planes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, because a quartet is such an intense environment, so I thought that'd be interesting. So for me, as a musician, also the rehearsal process versus the performance itself is sometimes, in a sense, more rewarding because we're working with our colleagues, we're learning from our colleagues, working out ideas, and there's a lot of give and take. Ideally, there's some compromise, and I think generally it's a pretty good democratic system. I'll have to find out from you whether it really is or not. And so I would like to know more about this. So for instance, I'm more interested sometimes in going to hear an orchestra rehearse a concert rather than perform the concert itself because I want to know what they're working on. And the other comment that I wanted to make was that I think of practicing as problem solving. So a lot of my teaching, whether it's a technical issue or a musical issue, we're working out these ideas, and it basically, for me, it has an equation in a sense that I know that I want this ultimately, but I have to put these things together to get to that point. And that point, obviously, on the other side of the equation sign is the performance or the worked out interpretation at the performance level. And so in terms of thinking along these lines, I'm going to paraphrase a comment. And you're going to have to correct me, but I seem to recall somebody somewhere saying once upon a time that interpretation is 90% perspiration and 10% inspiration. And I'm not sure, or maybe that's a successful performance, I'm not sure, but I remember that like the 90% perspiration, 10% inspiration, or something like that. Anyway, so I want to introduce Philip Setzer, and first I will talk about the Emerson Quartet. It's named for Ralph Waldo Emerson, and it has achieved recognition as one of the world's top chamber music ensembles since its formation in 1976, most recently through a 7th Grammy Award for its recording of quartet works by Grieg. They're wonderful. You should go get them today. The group's reputation partially rests upon its daring interpretations of core string quartet repertory, and it has performed the complete quartet cycles of Beethoven, Shostakovich, and Bartók in major concert halls around the world, in addition to lots of other repertoire. Philip Setzer began studying the violin at the age of 5 with his parents, who were both violinists in the Cleveland Orchestra. He continued his studies with Joseph Gingold and Raphael Drurian, and later at the Juilliard School with Oskar Shumsky. In 1967, Mr. Setzer won second prize at the Merriweather Post competition in Washington, D.C., and in 1976 received a bronze medal at the Queen Elizabeth International Competition in Brussels. He has appeared with many symphony orchestras, as soloist, among them the National Symphony, Aspen Chamber Symphony, Memphis Symphony, New Mexico, Puerto Rican, Omaha, and Anchorage Symphony Orchestras, and as soloist with the Cleveland Orchestra. He has been a regular faculty member of the Isaac Stern Chamber Music Workshops at Carnegie Hall and the Jerusalem Music Center. He also teaches as visiting professor of violin and chamber music at SUNY Stony Brook and has given master classes at schools around the world. Please join me in welcoming Philip Setzer. And I wanted to throw somebody else into the mix, and who better than Martin Nass. And Martin's going to speak about they have a very interesting connection, but I'm going to introduce Dr. Martin Nass, who has been a psychoanalyst for almost 50 years and clinical professor and supervisor in the New York University postdoctoral program since 1971. He is also professor emeritus at Brooklyn College of the City University of New York, where he established and directed a graduate psychology program for many years. Currently, he is a member of the faculty and a training and supervising analyst at the New York Freudian Society, so you didn't have too far to go.
That's right.
Yeah. And for many years, he has been actively engaged in the study of the creative process in composers and has interviewed many prominent contemporary American composers. He has been playing and studying the violin since the age of 8 and is actively involved in amateur chamber music ensembles. Please join me in welcoming Martin Nass. And before we turn it over to Fillmore, perhaps you wanted to say a few words.
I would
yes?
very much like to. I first want to say I'm very delighted to be in this company and with these wonderfully gifted artists. And I was thinking about my connection with Philip Setzer, which goes back, we just realized, to 1982, at which time I began going back after kind of just noodling around on the violin to some serious playing, and asked a number of friends of mine who were musicians to help me find a teacher. Phil's name came up a number of times, and I think I worked with him for about, 5 or 6 years? Yeah. And then what happened was the Emerson Quartet. First they got a residency at Lincoln Center at the Chamber Society, then they got professorships at City College, and then they were gone all over the world. So I'm very happy to be here with you. And with Stephanie, I just saw Bonnie Kaufman walk in. I met Stephanie about 5 years ago. We were on a program at Mohonk Mountain House, which paired 3 creative artists, a painter, a writer, and a musician, with 3 analysts. And Stephanie and I were paired, and we talked about listening and interpretation in both music and in psychoanalysis. So actually, we've in many ways come full circle. I've been involved with her organization, Music of the Spheres. I've spoken a couple of times at their concerts. This Thursday night on Schumann.
Yes.
And the program features Schumann and his followers.
And his circle,
His circle
so
of
the
people.
music of his time.
So if you're free on Thursday night, come on down.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much
Sure.
for the plug. I appreciate that. We have a sort of an experiment in mind, but before we go to that point, I just want to talk to you a little bit about some of the basics of interpretation. What would you? Yes. Well, what do you do when you're either with the quartet or yourself as an artist when you're looking at something for the first time and you know that you're going to be taking this process to the point of a performance, and of course it's a performance of a very high caliber,
Right.
because all of your performances are
absolutely.
scrutinized and they're all equally important, but the quartet especially tends to play in very important venues. So.
And we try to make it on a high level.
Yeah, well, no, I mean
we do
that's a
try,
given,
yeah,
but I
that's
mean,
right.
but you also do have this sort of pressure always to be
Absolutely.
performing at your and the reputation of this quartet is such that I mean the integrity is enormous. I mean, of the musicians that I know who speak of the quartet when we've talked about it, they just hold all of you in the highest admiration, and it has a lot to do with your interpretations, but also the level of performance. You're so consistent as
See,
a
that
performing
doesn't
group.
make it easier when she tells me this. I should be practicing. No.
But
Anyway,
so let's say you're opening up your score,
well,
and it's you yourself.
it's
before you go to the first
before you
rehearsal
go.
with
Well,
the quartet.
it's interesting. You know, to answer this question, I could say what I do now, but I think it might be more interesting to talk just a little bit about how what I do or what we do has changed over the years, because
Okay.
it's a little more complicated answer and a little more interesting answer, I think. I mean, going back, way back to when I was a kid, we had a lot of music on you know, the radio, or this is before there was much TV, or much, you know, before The Sopranos, like way back, you know, when there wasn't much on TV. And we listened to a lot of music. It was just music on. My parents had recordings on a lot. And when I was old enough, I started going to concerts every week, Cleveland Orchestra concerts. This was at the time of George Zell and great artists coming every week. I had music seep into me beyond what I could say was any kind of intellectual exercise. I mean, it was. I had great teachers in the very beginning who sort of told me what to do, but it was more than that. I was listening to music all of the time. I became used to hearing other people's interpretations as a way into a piece of music. And I think if you fast forward now to when I started on my own, so to speak, I mean, I wasn't studying anymore. I wasn't having a coach or a teacher tell me, you know, do this, do this, do this. This is the way we do it. Try it, you know. Or this is the way we do it. Do it. It began to shift slowly, but in the beginning, I think most of what I did was listen to a lot of recordings of a particular piece, especially if it was of, you know, of an artist or a group that I really admired. I remember my way into the Bartók quartets was to listen to the Juilliard quartet recording that I had, you know, from that time. That was my way into the you know, the New Viennese school, listening to their recordings of that. With the Beethoven quartets, I had the big Guarneri quartet, you know, stack like that,
Yes.
of those things
LPs
called.
too,
Remember those
yeah.
things, those big black things that we used to have? I mean, I listened to those recordings over and over and over again, and to be really honest about it, when I started working on, even when I was a student, when I started working on the first Beethoven quartet, and Gene Drucker and I were students together and in a quartet together going back to 1970, so we're coming up on 40 years now playing quartets together. I admit, I listened to the Guarneri recording and I tried as best I could to imitate Arnold Steinhardt's playing, because I just thought it was beautiful and poetic, and that was kind of a jumping off point for me. And at a certain point I thought, well, okay, I shouldn't be just imitating things. And even, you know, it wasn't even so much of a conscious decision as that I just stopped doing that. And then years would go by and I would go back and sometimes hear that recording that I had based my interpretation on, and realized, as great as it is, was, and always will be, I had moved away from that. Now, what made me move away from that? Obviously, things changed in terms of working on a piece with the other people, because if I'm going to be imitating Arnold Steinhardt, doesn't mean that Gene is going to be imitating John Daly and, you know, the violist Michael Tree. And so, I mean, these things shifted a little bit as we went along. We certainly, when we got to the point of performing the Beethoven cycle, we did again listen to a lot of things, especially when we were going to come to recording it. But I think at a certain point, I started to rely, and the quartet started to rely more and more on the score, on the printed score, and whatever information we could derive from that, rather than listening so much to recordings. And I found, especially as I came closer to recording dates of great pieces, for instance, this Schubert trios I'm about to record, I listened to a lot of recordings a few weeks ago, but now I don't want to. I don't want to hear, you know.
You don't want that info.
I don't want to hear how great Heifetz played this in 1942, and I'll never be able to do it that well. You know, I mean, technically, it's like unbelievable. If you don't know that recording, you should hear it with Feuermann and Rubinstein, 1941 or 42. It's just unbelievable.
Feuermann also.
Yeah, with no editing, you know, just like straight through. Right. Okay.
Yeah, the two of them.
Superhuman. So, yeah, that's not a good thing to listen to the night before you go into record this. No, but I think that the score has to be honored, and especially when we come into the recording studio, we start listening to playbacks. We do a run-through of a movement, and we listen to it, and we're sitting there with the scores and going, you know, he doesn't really write a crescendo there. Why are we doing that? And he doesn't really... He says pianissimo here, and it, you know, we're too soft before it because it doesn't really.
You don't have that moment where you
where it just really or suddenly shifts or whatever. So you start really relying on whatever information was left to us, and it's very difficult, especially with earlier music, earlier than Beethoven, because there's very little clues. You know, Mozart, Haydn, if you go back to the original scores, they gave us very little to go on.
Well, for your Schubert trio, for instance, do you have an Urtext score that you're using?
Yeah, I've got two Urtexts, and they're completely different in a lot of ways. Well, there's no manuscript of the B-flat at all. And the E-flat, there are two different sources and a lot of interpretation about it. So it's... This
is a real issue, actually, for musicians, because...
So they were edited, actually?
Yeah, the Urtexts have been interpreted.
Of course, Urtext meaning according to the autograph or the text or the original sources.
Original manuscript. But sometimes the original manuscript is different from the first printing, which is different from the printing of the parts, as opposed to the score, as you know.
And another factor, actually, that we have to keep in mind when we're dealing with early compositions that were printed, because, for instance, I did a big study of the Beethoven Opus 12 sonatas a number of years ago, and there's no autograph of those. There's a fragment of one page that I saw in microfilm in the library, but other than that, there are a number of very early editions. But then you start understanding the problems with music publishing. You know, if you're talking about 1800, for instance, 1798, 1800, you know, it's a very laborious process and very inexact, and so they actually would make a lot of mistakes just in preparing the plates. And things like legato markings, the slur markings, often would get broken up because those had to be engraved in by hand, which is why often you see if the staves are going one direction for part of a run and then they turn. There's a slur that actually originally would have gone like that, and it gets turned into two groupings. And even the Urtext Henley people will do that, or Barenreiter, because it's you know, it's what they see. So you have to, but you're talking about a process that really involves finding your own voice to sort of separate from the teaching and discovering what kind of sound you want to be making and what kind of expression you want to make.
And it's also very different. It's very different when you're preparing for a recording and when you're preparing for a performance. Now, in our group, there are a couple of rules. It is not a democratic organization.
Okay,
Because
good.
in a democratic organization,
Yes.
you have a vote and the majority wins. In our group, if somebody really, really doesn't want to do something, we don't do it. Well, that could be a mezzo forte in measure 12. It could be taking a particular concert date. It could be approving a recording of a live concert for broadcast. It could be a photograph, whatever. So in that regard, it has to be unanimous in our group. And the reason I think that's been good is that the reason we decided not to have a vote and the majority winning is that then you run the risk of often having one person who's really unhappy with the results. And so we decided, no, that's not right. If one person really doesn't want to do something, or obviously if the majority doesn't want to do it, we're not going to do it. Because if one person doesn't want to do it, we're not going to do it.
What even is your process for deciding what repertoire you play? I mean, is that something that you decide, or the presenters helps you?
Well, it's our decision, but it's also a decision with the record company, maybe, and sometimes with presenters if they're looking for a particular. And if you get invited to go to, for instance, to Leipzig for the Mendelssohn celebration in '09. Okay, so. That year we're going to play Mendelssohn. There's a lot of that, anniversaries and of births or deaths or bar mitzvahs or whatever that we have to honor. In Mendelssohn's case, that's a little questionable, but I don't think he was bar mitzvahed, even though he was Jewish. No.
Well,
no. Not that we know of, anyway.
Jakob Ludwig, Felix Mendelssohn. Yeah.
Yeah, I know. Well, he should have been bar mitzvahed.
Yeah, but
anyway.
Well, yes. Do you ever start the process and then realize we don't want to complete it, that we don't like this piece enough after all?
We just had that.
Okay, talk about that, please.
Well,
we're listening now.
We decided with our record company Deutsche Grammophon that we were going to do the Janacek quartets, which we were about to record the end of May, and we wanted to put something with that. And there was a lot of discussion about what to do. And we decided, the company really wanted us to record some Martinu. And I've always been intrigued by Martinu, but I've always had trouble with the quartets. I've always liked most of each quartet, but there was always one movement that I didn't like, and I kept thinking, if you could just kind of put the first movement of that one with the... It's terrible, but this is honestly the way I feel. With the middle one of this one and the last movement of that one, you'd have a great piece. It's just like they're a little bit uneven. But we listened. I passed all these things, all these quartets around, and we decided. Larry and I decided that Larry especially, really wanted to do the madrigals, which are for violin and viola, and they were written for Lillian and Joseph Fuchs. And Lillian was a teacher of Larry's. So,
this is Larry Dutton that you're speaking of.
Larry Dutton, the violist of the Emerson Quartet. And they're wonderful pieces. I mean, I think the madrigals it's really one of his absolute greatest pieces. So that was wonderful, but then we had to find a quartet that would fit with it. So we listened to the shortest quartet, which is the third quartet, and everybody said, okay, it's good, we'll do the madrigals and we'll do this. And then we started working on the third quartet, and we played it once. And just didn't really like it. Just didn't really like it.
Yeah. So because it takes an enormous commitment.
It got pushed aside. But that's pretty rare. I mean, that doesn't happen very often.
Yeah.
A couple of times we've had contemporary pieces written for us, and we've programmed them like for the next year before we. Yeah, that was a mistake. We don't do anymore.
That's always a risk, isn't it?
I mean, now it's like we get.
How do you work it out? You say, we want to play through the piece before we commit to.
Yeah, we play it. First before we commit. Sometimes you have to play it 3 times for them to get the commission, and that's fine. And we do play a lot of contemporary music. But
yes.
We've had a few situations where the piece has been written and we just don't care for it.
It's tough sometimes, isn't it, with contemporary music because
I won't mention any names.
Yes, we won't. We better not. Yes.
With contemporary music, you're able to talk to the composer and know what the composer intends.
Right, and that's a very interesting process.
Big difference between looking at a score that
and that's interesting because I think that has also influenced the way that we've come to interpret older scores by working with a lot of composers and seeing what they're really interested in. Of course, every composer is different, every piece of music is different, but you do get a different idea when you when you've been working on a new piece with a composer, then you go back and work on a Beethoven quartet, or even there's something. It's a fine line as an interpreter. Mm-hmm. You want to honor the score, but of course, it's not enough to do just exactly what it's like. It's like reading a play and having doing all the stage directions that are in the play. Of course, that's not enough just to really staging an interesting production of even a play like Pinter mm-hmm. or Beckett, which is very specific. Yeah. There's still some room for interpretation as a director, not to mention as an actor. Mm-hmm. How do you say this line exactly? Yes. How do you do this, mm-hmm. honoring the dynamic or the accents that are in that phrase, or the tempo marking, maybe with a metronome or not with a metronome. The metronome was invented, probably you all know this, but it was invented during Beethoven's lifetime.
Perfected, ostensibly had been around, but it's really...
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And he became intrigued with it for a couple of reasons, I think. We all know that Beethoven, from 1800 on, started to lose his hearing. And I think Beethoven is the first composer, talking about text, he's the first composer to write a lot of details into the score, which is partly that his music became more extreme, mm-hmm. and probably would have anyway, even if he hadn't had the problem with his hearing, because that was his personality. Mm-hmm. Even early Beethoven has much more extremes of dynamics and
you hear music as a much more personal experience.
It reflects his personality, which was a bit extreme.
Yeah, which of course then becomes a romantic idea, doesn't it? Yeah.
But I think the fact that he was growing deaf made him less and less secure about how his music was going to be interpreted, because he couldn't hear it anymore. So he starts writing in more and more, and then I think
accents, particularly Sforzandi. The sforzando was scarcely used, even a scant 25 years before 1800. In Mozart's manuscripts, the violin concerti, for instance, you look at it and there's very little there in a sense. You have a few dynamic indicators, and you have some accents, and we have a variety of accents that we work with. There's sort of the normal one that looks, how do you describe that shape?
Sideways V.
Yeah. Whatever. And then sforzando, and then there are many others, forte piano, and each composer may use these differently. And so if you're really a responsible musician, you have to sort of sort these ideas out, and what exactly do they mean. And just because you have figured it out, you think, for one composer, doesn't necessarily apply what Beethoven does to Schubert or to a lot of other composers.
In Schubert it can be a kind of vocal accent.
And so you have to really look for the affect of the moment. Sort of the emotional content, I think, that's behind behind the idea. If I could interject something,
sure.
You were talking about how you want to sort of editorialize some of the scores now, and it's interesting because as one becomes a better musician and we have more experience, we know more, we have more breadth of experience. And for instance, on this concert that I'm playing next, we're doing one of Mendelssohn's piano quartets. Felix Mendelssohn wrote 3 piano quartets. And the first one was when he's about 12 years old. The second one was he's about 14, and the third he's about 15. And so I've programmed in his middle period for his piano quartets. And mind you, another aspect, of course, is that we didn't have the modern bow until about 1780, and it was not really in popular use. This produces a more sustained sound from the classical bow or transitional bow or the Baroque bows that preceded it. And of course, pianos were changing a lot too. Beethoven wrote in his Opus 12 sonatas, for instance, that, and of course, these composers want their music to be played by as many people as possible, but that it could be played by forte piano or clavier, which is like a generic term, or harpsichord. And so you see that there are really no pedal markings. And so, because he wanted, even though the forte piano had been around since about 1700, it originates with Bartolomeo Cristofori in Florence, and in fact there's one at the museum from 1720. The use of the sustaining mechanism, this idea of sustaining the sound, really wasn't perfected until nearly 1800. It was really the last decade or so that you see people moving away from harpsichords into forte pianos. And so with that also led to a change in dynamics, because of course with the harpsichord you have basically terrace dynamics. You have the illusion of something that's louder or softer, but with the innovations, that were really of a technological nature happening, especially in the keyboard instrument, but also with the violin, it really changed the way people thought about sound, and also probably how to notate these sounds. And so it's a very interesting thing that was happening there.
Yeah, I've often thought if they had invented the modern Steinway, the Hamburg Steinway that we hear now, probably Beethoven could have heard his music for another year or two.
Yeah.
It's like,
but yeah, getting back to these Mendelssohn piano quartets, they're charming, but occasionally you're reminded that even though a lot of his gestures are in place, that he still is very young,
right,
and not fully matured. Although his full maturity was 38 when he died. So yes, unfortunately, I would like to start moving us towards the Great Experiment, and so you've talked about.
I have one more question.
Oh yes, okay. Sorry, Martin.
About markings, and that is when you're working with a composer. Does the composer ever change what he or she has written because of your input?
All the time.
Okay.
And I mean, this is what I was going to say, just to throw a couple of other little vignettes into the mix here. I remember Rostropovich telling us with the cello concerto that was written for him as one of the really first big internationally famous pieces, because Rostropovich traveled around and played this piece all over the place. When it was premiered, Shostakovich, who relied a lot on his friends who were performing his music, especially because of the whole political atmosphere at that time with Stalin, he held on to his not only his friendships dearly, but their interpretation of his music very dearly. And he heard the first performance of the cello concerto, the first cello concerto, in Moscow, I believe, and took from, it was before it had been published, it was still in manuscript at that point, and of course Slava played it by memory, as he did everything. The music, when it was printed with the metronome markings of Rostropovich's first performance. Okay? I mean, he had a tape, I guess, of the performance, and he checked all the tempi, and he put against the metronome, and he put those metronome markings into the score of the first cello concerto, where they still exist in the printing of the first cello concerto. So Slava goes and plays this all over the world, and comes back, and Shostakovich hears this about 100, maybe 200 performances later.
Yeah.
And of course it's changed, because
Yeah.
I mean, this is a whole other thing that I didn't even get to yet.
Oh, the maturation
which is that
process,
not only as you work through a piece, but as you perform a piece, it changes. It just, I mean, we all change, and we're not even aware of it. It's sort of like looking at your child growing up. When you see them every day, you don't even notice the changes so much. But when you see your nephew once a year, it's like, whoa, you really, it's a little bit like that. And this was a little bit like this particular story. So he heard Slava play the cello concerto again, and apparently Shostakovich came running. He was very excitable. He came running backstage, all freaked out, just saying, "Slava, you've got to tell everyone. You've got to get all of the publications back, and you've got to tell every cellist in the world that the metronome markings are all wrong, because they're not the same."
Yeah.
And Slava said, what do you want from me? This is the way I play it now. I mean, so he was terribly upset. That's a good example. What do you take from the score? I mean, you have to start with it. You have to take what they wrote. And I hear some. I do a lot of teaching now, and a group comes in and plays a Beethoven quartet for me, and I'm sitting there with the score, a piece. I know the piece by memory. I don't have to look at the score. I know what's in there. And I'm watching one thing after another go by that they're not doing. And I'm going, why? Because a lot of the markings are really good. I mean, most of the markings are really good. I'm not even talking about how you do the final interpretation of it, but it's just ignoring things. It's not even doing what it's ignoring what the composer. So that's not good. But so then I have other groups that come in and do everything that's exactly there, and that's not right either. You know?
Yeah.
Because they haven't made it their own, or they copy our performance from a recording.
Well, they're still in that process of listening to you.
Why are you doing that? And they'll say, because it's on your recording. I was like, yeah, well then that's a good reason not to do it. You know?
Well, you used to do that though,
Right, you know, but there's funny stories about that too. Just one other little story, which will give you a good example of interpretation. This is back to Arnold Steinhardt from the Guarneri Quartet told me the story years ago. This is back when the quartet was just sort of starting out. He calls me up and he says, I just want to tell you something. He said, I was listening to radio and I tuned it in, and it was a Beethoven Opus 18 No. 6 quartet. And it had already started, and I didn't know who it was. It was a live performance, and I'm listening to it and thinking, you know, it's quite good. It's really quite good. I mean, they obviously have the technique they have the potential to be a really good quartet. I'll bet it's the Emerson Quartet. I haven't heard them live yet, but I've heard great things. I bet that's who it is. They're a little young. They're not quite there yet. It gets the end of the piece, and of course that was the Guarneri String Quartet. and so he like runs the phone, calls me. Says, I just had to tell you this story. So our perception of what we do, of what should be done, is constantly changing, is constantly confused and confusing, and that's part of what makes it interesting.
Well, I was going to say that living with a piece, though, and performing it, it's like, the relationship that you have with your colleagues, for instance. It spans so many years now. You probably know each other's thoughts and can read each other's minds.
Absolutely.
And it's like a marriage. It's like a very good friendship that endures, that you go into things on a much more subtle basis. And so things that used to be sort of at the forefront,
right.
I mean, like the first time I play a piece, I have to make sure I'm counting properly.
Yeah, exactly.
Like with the Mendelssohn, I don't want to come in wrong. And so I'm using my ears and I want to be in the flow, but I'm also just sort of
It's
sitting
really
there
embarrassing to get lost in a Mozart string quartet.
And
it's not good.
Sometimes these things are treacherous, and so
it does happen sometimes.
Until
you've
played it enough times that you really can sort of let go, and then you do get to the point where you
did
can
you
let
play
go.
the repeat?
That's happened. That's happened a couple of times too. Well, Heinz Holliger, who is a great oboist and wonderful composer and one of the most brilliant musicians around, once took a repeat in a minuet. He's supposed to take it once. He took it again, and I thought, okay, if Heinz Holliger can do something that stupid, I don't feel so bad every time I do something stupid.
No, we all do that, unfortunately. Yes.
But it's also very different when you're preparing for a recording than from a performance. So this I just want to mention because it's important.
Yeah.
In terms of a group, especially when you're going to take a piece on tour and play it 10 times, every night you'll come into the rehearsal and one person will say, I'm really tired of this way we've been doing it for years, or didn't we say we weren't going to do this and now it's crept back in, or could we try this? And generally speaking, the other three will say, okay, because you're going to try it that night and you're going to come back to it 2 days later, and if you hate it, you can say, no, let's not do that. Or maybe another third way will result from that. But when you're recording, that's when it's tough, because that's permanent.
Yes. It's horrible to listen to the...
And it's just like looking at the mirror the way you actually look. That's sort of what the recording process is like, except without any makeup or nice black background
and also things that don't really translate when you're in a live concert setting, and on a stage with a live acoustic and an audience out there. I mean, like, for instance, the endings of notes. If you have a very long, quiet note as a string player, that's one of the hardest things to do well in a recording, because you're supposed to go into silence from that.
Yeah. And the mics are much closer to you than
and the mics will pick up everything, including the boat not quite tracking, or if the sound doesn't end together, or if you have a rate of diminuendo that's not quite equal. And I mean, things like that we think about for concerts, but they're not so critical, get really magnified by a microphone. And of course, string quartets, the intonation always is such an issue. It's the hardest thing to do well. which is why you see very few people playing string quartets on most sort of ad hoc chamber music programs, because it's a very, very hard thing to do, because the intonation is much more exposed if you're playing with piano, or even string trio or string quintet. There's something easier about that combination than the string quartet writing.
Well, string trio is easier only because there's one less person to play out the
But
tune.
string quintets, you know, it's not.
No, quintets,
There's something a little bit
gets
easier
lost
about
in the shuffle
it.
a little more.
Yeah, and then of course they have to have a comparable attack to their notes and vibrato and all these factors that are really so critical. So yeah, admiration.
Well, you know, one of the composers, I mean, Beethoven, as I said, was one of probably the first one to write a lot of details into his score, and you see this go further and further as it gets
Elgar.
Elgar.
Oh my God! Yeah.
You get toward the 20th century, you start to see. I mean, in Berg, of course, it goes along with this kind of expressionist music. You know, there's like the dynamics that Beethoven, the extreme dynamics that Beethoven get, you know, multiplied tremendously by the time you get to Berg and Schoenberg and Weber, and every note has some marking on it practically. Another composer that was very exacting about his markings was Bartók, and Bartók also became obsessed with the metronome, to the point of he was also very much involved with mathematics and proportion in his writing, as we now know that Mozart was. You know, the whole, but in Mozart's case, it happened in a way completely naturally. His whole sense of the rightness of a phrase.
He probably has natural golden sections.
He did.
Occurring.
He did.
Yeah.
I mean, his brain was
it was roughly 5/8.
It was exactly
5 parts.
His brain
to 3
was
parts,
the golden
3
mean.
parts to 5 parts.
You look up the definition of the golden mean. It has Mozart's brain in it.
Bartók was really sort of into the numerology, wasn't he?
Yes, and Bartók became very much involved also with the golden mean, especially in certain pieces. The fifth quartet apparently is all figured out from that point of view of proportion, and to the point where he not only marks every metronome marking, but he marks every section, how long it should take, down to half seconds. Okay, so this is a person.
Intimidating.
Yeah. So this section should last 14 1/2 seconds. I mean, it's in the music, and you're going like, come on, are you kidding me? But there was some mathematical reason.
So when you were recording this quartet, did you actually try to work out the math, or?
You mean to the half second?
Well, no. Like the relationships and what kind of mathematical entities were present.
But no. I mean,
because that would probably take a year.
I just
in
don't
and of
have.
itself. You don't have enough time.
I'm just too busy. No, it was interesting. We tried to follow the metronome markings as closely as we could, but still giving it a certain freedom. And that's what our little experiment is going to be about today. And I think
yes, we've been putting it off long enough. We both have been procrastinating, but we thought we would try to demonstrate this process. And because it's usually something that is not for public consumption, I think we put it off as long as we could. And and so Phil suggested that we do a short movement, a short piece by Bartók, and these are duos for 2 violins that were composed roughly when?
They were well, he worked on them over a period of years, but they were some of them are arrangements of other pieces. The one we're going to do is an arrangement of an earlier part of what's called the Petite Suite, which is, I think, from 1936.
And that's for piano.
For piano solo. And we are going to do one of the duos, which he worked on with Szigeti, as he did with the Mikrokosmos. Are any of you familiar with the Mikrokosmos? Yeah. You know, it was a pedagogical endeavor.
Because there are 44 of these duos?
Yeah, there actually are some more that have been found since then. But the idea with Mikrokosmos and with these was to make something that started very simply and became more and more complicated, not only in terms of the individual playing, but also the rhythm of, the rhythms became more complicated. And these were done later. These were done, in the 40s.
Start getting your fiddle out. And so you selected one which is called Sorrow, and you have recorded these, however, haven't you?
Gene and I recorded all of the duos.
Gene Drucker and you.
Gene Drucker, yeah.
And so, because I wanted to try to keep this experiment pure, I've actually never played this before. I didn't play through it. We haven't rehearsed it, and I
thought I was going to play the other part, so I recorded the other part. Okay. So
well, whatever you want to do. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually read through it. We brought along a metronome because Bartók gives us a metronome marking. So we're going to try to be, as if I'm doing it for the first time, you're not, but starting the process out. And then at the end of it, we're actually going to listen to Bartók's own performance of this on the piano, and which apparently has a few, surprises perhaps. And then we'll come back and we'll quickly work out some things, and you'll see us discuss some ideas. We won't be too long about it, and then we'll play it again, and maybe you'll hear some transformations, some developments that have occurred between the cold reading and then working out, and then the final quote performance. And so, apologies in advance.
Yeah, yes.
From me.
No,
from me, because.
But that's part of the process.
Yes.
You always have to apologize.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, go to the first rehearsal. I haven't really worked out this page yet, and
listen. Every time we play with Yefim Bronfman, I'm sure you're all familiar with what incredible technique Yefim has. What a great pianist and musician he is. He's always like, I'm so sorry. I haven't had time to practice, to prepare. It's just, I'm really sorry. And then, in the rehearsal, he's sort of pretends to fumble around a little bit, and then the concert comes, it's like, it's always this learning curve, But actually, the learning curve is really like that, but he always makes it seem like it's so anyway, we're not as, I don't think we're as bad as we think we're going to be.
Should I take your A?
I think we should apologize.
Well, I have to. So.
Oh,
okay. Oh.
Perfect. Unbelievable.
Suits.
Now it's interesting. Most composers give you one metronome marking, one number. And he says marking is lento, and then says poco rubato. And rubato, the Italian word rubato means to steal. So it means to have freedom. You steal, you give back, kind of thing. So he writes 72 to 69, which is already strange because most composers would write 69 to 72. But I guess he wants it to start out. So all right, so that's a clue, okay? That's a clue. He wants it to have a certain flow to it, but maybe the rubato should be on the slower side, right? Maybe?
Maybe.
I mean, maybe that's why you wrote that?
Is this poco ritenuto?
Then he has poco ritard, and then...
Is it ritenuto or ritardando?
It just says rit.
That's a big problem, by the way, all of you composers out there. When you write, rit period, we don't know whether you mean ritardando, which is progressively getting slower, or ritenuto, which is held back. So
Yeah.
just yes.
I think we'll just get slower.
Well, I'll do whatever. Oh, I have the moving notes there, don't I?
Yeah, it's
Oh,
up to
okay.
you.
It'll be that's what we'll
We'll
work
talk
on
about it.
afterwards.
We'll talk
Yeah.
about it.
So this is 72, and just for all of you, this is 69.
Wait, which one?
Okay. Apologies in
So-
advance.
Now we honestly have not
We really haven't.
rehearsed this.
I mean, he said to me, he said, shouldn't we run through it beforehand so we don't embarrass ourselves? And I said, no, that's the whole idea. I think we have to embarrass ourselves, and then
Right.
maybe we'll get better. So you can
Right.
tell us if
So
we get
this
better.
is, all right, this is like we're going to perform this.
And mind you, he's
tomorrow.
already recorded this thing. He
Yeah, but I
knows
did
it.
the other part, so
Oh,
it's got
all right.
it's got my initial next to the wrong line here. So anyway,
Okay.
all
So we're
right.
playing with top line.
I'm going to start.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. Okay.
Yeah. We should have had you time it. We should have had you time it because
yes.
it says 2 minutes and 6 seconds.
Okay, next time.
Anybody time
next
it?
time around? Yeah.
Okay.
So, should we listen?
Well, let's talk a little bit about what we just did,
all right.
okay? Because I think it's interesting. Now,
I think we have to have another take on the last note for intonation.
well, that was my fault.
Yeah. Oh, no, it's my fault.
Because I have to match you. That was too sharp.
Okay, thank you.
But I mean, I could have played it in tune, but I thought we should make it a little,
Yeah, that folk element.
less perfect.
Yeah.
I didn't want to show off or anything.
That's true.
So, no, I mean, a lot of good things happen there, and we've never played together either.
Ever, yeah.
We shared a car back
Yeah.
from Stony Brook once.
That's right.
So
We talked a
and
little.
a couple of emails.
You agreed to
and
do
that's
this.
about-
Yeah,
and
we got along well enough that he said,
Yeah,
"Yes, I'll come and do this with you today."
I think it was the emails actually where it.
Yeah.
Where we
And actually, when I first started writing to him, he started signing his name, Phil Octides.
Right. There
So,
you go.
yeah.
We share the same
Phil
first name.
Octides Setzer, yes.
So, I mean, we both have had a lot of experience playing chamber music, playing Bartók. So there's some things that we did naturally. Now, you all know that the stress of the first, the short note, long note is very typical of Hungarian folk music, typical of Bartók's music, typical of the Hungarian language. So the yada, that kind of motive you see in a lot of Bartók, and we both did that naturally. We also kind of followed each other at certain places. In the second part of this, the second violin has the upper line. So even though I gave the gesture to play to start it, it actually should have come from her. But I didn't want to. I was worried about the 2 minutes and 6 seconds. I don't play too long.
That's
but
okay.
we could just agree
that's
that,
part
that
of
you would
a normal
that you would
thing
lead
to
that.
do because
Right.
I defer to your knowing this piece.
Yeah, but
so
you
if
have
he wants to give the cue.
You have the higher line, so you probably should.
So
lead
okay,
that.
next time I'll do
next
that.
time
okay.
you do that.
Was the rest though? Was that in
The rest was more or less.
Okay, all right.
More or less. That was fine. So now the other thing is we tried to do this poco rubato idea to try to give it a little bit of freedom. I think what would be interesting now is to hear Bartók's rendition of the piano piece, which is the same piece of music. And I haven't seen the music to see what he's written, but I would imagine that he's put a metronome marking there, which is similar to this.
Maybe somebody could time it.
And it's called I think it's called Slow Song or something like that. It doesn't have the name Sadness or Sorrow on it. But let's listen to Bartók play that same piece, and listen especially for the rubato that he takes. Okay.
Wow, that is really...
Now, what's interesting to me is that the first and last sections where the music is bum, ba, da, dee, da, dum, he plays absolutely straight. There's no rubato at all, right? Dee, da, dee, da, dum, bum.
Yeah.
Then there's a retard. But in this music, the... And as much as I could imagine doing rubato, is nowhere close to the distortion. If you want to use that word, I mean, it's so
because
free.
what we see, ya-da, ba-dum, ba, you know.
And your part, I mean, you listen to his part, to your part, the way he plays it, it's like instead of... underneath when I'm playing that other music, he's playing something like...
And it's supposed to be all even quarter notes,
you listen to something like that, and then you look at the Fifth Quartet, which has given you these metronome markings, and down to the half second of how long he wants. So is it supposed to be free, but still come out to 23.5 seconds, or I mean, how good is your sense of rubato? I mean, it's supposed to be like a jazz player where you've got the beat going constantly underneath, but you're playing around it? Or does he not really intend that? Or is it that when he performs, he becomes another animal?
These are all valid questions.
Which is, I don't know. I don't know the answer.
Another thing to think about here, and of course I'm operating on a completely different level than you, not knowing this, but he's given this the title of Sorrow, right? That's his own title for this, although it's called the slow song, I think, in the piano version, which is interesting, because if you think about sorrow, we have ya-da-da-dum, that's a gesture. It's sort of falling, and it's almost like somebody who's like shaking their head.
It's more grieving,
because I mean, sometimes composers will give you like a sighing gesture, and it's like literally somebody going like that. Yeah. And so this is something which is more impassioned, but it's all, sort of like somebody doing this. And so it can't be too even, I guess, to really have that.
You're right. It's more very passionate, and it's not sadness in the sense of depression. It's more sorrow. I mean, grieving kind of sorrow. And in the other edition, it's marked sorrow. I mean, the translation from the Hungarian that he gave, I don't know the Hungarian word, but apparently it means more sorrow than sadness. There's a fine distinction between those two words.
So there's sort of this sense of, in the introduction, he's sort of setting the stage for harmonically what we're going to be doing. But it's this introductory material, but it's also sort of a resignation, but then you have this impassioned kind of railing against, an angry sorrow. Or
so do you want to try it? I mean, let's try to, just as a departure point.
Yeah.
Let's try to imitate a little bit what he did.
Yeah, cool.
Okay, I mean, to go as far as we can without getting completely
and these carrots that he puts in, these stroke markings.
Yeah.
Is an interesting thing because we have sort of it's an upside down V, but also a line, and so he seems to sort of move into it, but then play rather pesante.
Yeah, he wants
rhythmically.
a heavy
kind of so that we really feel.
He wrote 3 different kinds of accents. Bartók did to help us be further confused. There's the accent, the normal accent that you see in Mozart and Beethoven and Mendelssohn, all the way up through to contemporary music, which is really this kind of a, where one note just sort of sticks out, or in Schubert's that kind of accent, which is more, that kind of vocal kind of up, up to the air kind of accent, not a mean accent, but a vocal kind of Viennese accent, light,
So maybe a thing to try in general also is when the line is descending, he seems to sort of follow gravity a little bit.
Yes, he does.
In the opening,
so
even where it looks like it should be. So maybe I'll try that.
We should do that. The other kind of accent, he puts a dash, which in Bartók's language means a kind of stress, but not a real accent, but more. He doesn't really do that in here, but you see that in a lot of Bartok, where it has a stress, but not a nothing hard about it. This one, though, with the upside down V and the line, I think it should be a little bit harder rather than. That's the way I would do it if it didn't have the V. But so there's something a little bit angry about it almost, which again goes in with the idea of
the language
of the language and also
language.
grieving. Where some of it's not just that you're sad, but that you're actually the feeling that we all have when we lose someone. There's a degree of anger and so that finds its way as you go on. It doesn't occur in the first half of it. It only occurs the second half after the silence. So I think we'll see.
So it's even more pronounced.
We should play.
Yeah, and also he introduces he introduces double stops that we don't have before that.
Right.
So
really, you hear four-part harmony in certain measures here.
So he's filling out the sound, so
you sound like
a
quartet, yeah.
And then the other thing we can do, I guess, is really use the hairpins as an agogic device, move forward and then back a little bit.
Let's try it. Let's try that. Yeah. And just play the last note so I can check where.
Let me tune.
Perfect fit between her A and the lower note has to be absolutely perfect, or it's not going to sound in tune. I can move the C sharp around a little bit, and it's not going to sound. It'll sound either a little brighter or a little.
Or I could play your E for you.
Darker. Yeah, yeah, but that if I were playing then the other way, it would have less chance of being in tune. So I have to be careful that the E matches.
All right. Well, that'll be take 3.
We'll see. Okay. Yeah, we'll see.
So I'll try going with gravity a little bit more.
Okay. Okay. But let's maybe try not being too much rubato in the first.
Yeah, because it's still the quiet part of the sorrow.
Because that's the way he did it. Let's just see if we can.
You did this all in one bow, I take it, right?
Yeah, except the one time when I started on the wrong bow. Yes.
And then and then also sort of as a descending thing generally, or are you doing it up bow sometimes?
Yeah, I think I need to do another down bow on the second measure to come out.
So when you come in second measure, you're doing up? Or?
I think I'm going to try down bow this time.
Okay.
Let's do it maybe a tiny bit faster because his general tempo was a little faster.
Okay. All right.
Did it sound different?
Yes.
Oh, good.
Good.
By the way, I timed it.
Yeah?
2 minutes, 9 seconds.
Oh, well, we better do it again.
Yeah, really. Oh, that was fun. Cool.
Wonderful.
What's interesting is that the break occurred exactly at 1 minute.
Uh-huh.
Uh-huh.
Well,
Oh, so that's the Pythagorean ratio of 1 to 2. The octave, okay.
Wait, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11,
Are you looking for
1, 22, 23.
Measure numbers.
23 measures, and then 1 break, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. So what did I say, 23?
23
Yeah.
and 22.
23, 1 break, and then 22.
Uh-huh.
Fairly
That's,
exact.
yeah.
And there's a retard. There are 2 retards in the first part, so that makes it a little bit longer than the second. But you know, the first half of a concert should always be a little longer than the second.
So you said there are 22 plus
23 plus 22. I mean, 23 then the one
And the break.
break,
4,
and then
60, 64,
and then
66 total?
22.
Yeah. Okay.
So we'll
Well,
work on it.
okay.
Any questions about anything or comments or?
Yes.
I wonder if it's possible to really get exactly to where he was on the piano, because he's using some effects that are very specific to the piano set.
Right.
The minor seconds that are done simultaneously and tacked together, it has a very bite, which, so if you rewrote them for the violin, would you have expected it to be exactly the same?
I don't know. That's a good question. I tend to think not, actually. Because his understanding of the string instruments, even though he himself did not play a string instrument, although he apparently tried out a lot with the duos. He had an old fiddle that Szigeti had given him, and sort of tried things out a little bit just to sort of see how it would work with the fingering and all. But I don't know. That's a very good question. It's one of the ones I'll ask him if I ever see him. But you know, the other thing we didn't mention, which is of course very appropriate to this, is another clue to interpreting something is if there is actually a recording of the composer playing it. Now I've played the Shostakovich piano quintet many times. And there is a recording, or I think there are actually 2 recordings, of Shostakovich himself playing the quintet. And of course, I don't think that Shostakovich was as great a pianist in the whole, in looking at, I'm not just talking about his ability to play the notes, but in terms of being a really great artist on the piano, as Bartók was. Bartók was a fantastic pianist, and if you've never heard him play other music, you should try to. There's a recording on this set that I have of Bartók at the piano, just 6 CDs. I hope it's still available. There is one of the CDs is a performance from the Library of Congress of Bartók and Szigeti doing Debussy Sonata, second Bartók violin sonata, and the Kreutzer Sonata.
Oh, that must be amazing.
The one thing, of course, the Bartók is there. It's really like you've got to listen to this because listen to the way listen to all the colors and the rubato. Both of them, the way they play it is just so natural to them and so difficult for us to learn this language.
Well, he's importing in his music, like a lot of composers. I mean, it's the sounds of his own culture and
Right.
of his own time.
Right.
And that's what's, I think, sometimes difficult for us, you know, sort of in the conservatory setting, you know, to
sort
of
of what do we know about?
Yeah, you know,
But
to start
also
relating
the
to that.
Debussy is extraordinarily beautiful. The touch that he had at the piano. Now Shostakovich, I mean, he plays all the notes and everything, but it doesn't have. I mean, Shostakovich is one of my very favorite composers. But he's not one of my favorite pianists. It's sort of not really moving to hear him play his own pieces. You know, it's a little bit.
I found that sometimes.
It's a little bit mechanical, and so you have to wonder. Well, is the composer always the best interpreter, and how far do we go with taking that information? It's part of what we have to look at, though, or listen to.
One of the things I found in speaking with a number of composers, from time to time they've said the performers bring out something that they had no idea was in the music.
Well, that's why we have a job. You know? Otherwise, the composers would just play their own music.
I was once working with Earl Kim, who was a really wonderful composer, associated with Harvard for many years, and it was in Boston that I got to know him. And I was playing his caprices. Do you know his caprices for solo violin?
Yeah.
They're derived from Paganini, Schumann, and really hard. And I was actually the second person to play them. Mitzak was the first. And so I was trying to get my fingers around these things, and he'd sent me a note saying, I know that some things are unplayable, and and sure enough they were. I mean, you literally could not play that combination of notes the way he'd written them, and I thought, well, I guess I'll just do my best and bring it to him, and I knew I was going to be playing it. But there was one that had sort of a minimalist aspect to it, and it literally went dum bum bum dum 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 dum. And I was having a hard time because the notes were a little difficult, and I just thought, like, what motivates this? And so he was pretty minimalist, very expressive, but often very minimalist. And so I played for him, and I said, Earl, I'm trying to do this. It's very hard, but I mean, it would help me if I knew sort of what you were thinking. And he said, oh, well, my daughter Ava, who was like 3 years old at the time, he said she was sitting on the porch in the back porch of our house in Cambridge, and she was watching the leaves fall off the trees. And so she's sitting very still, and then the leaves are coming down one by one, and they were going like that, and then they would keep falling. And so, of course, okay, and that made all the difference for me. And if I hadn't, and he also made a little gesture. He would make a gesture, and I thought, okay, now I understand.
So you had a visual image of it.
Yeah, but that was exactly, and it perfectly captured, what the music was saying. Then I thought, of course, okay, that makes entirely, a lot of sense to me now, and I can do it. But
some of the most interesting lessons I've ever had from the great teachers that I was fortunate enough to study with had little stories or just visual elements, just thoughts, or they would say, think of it like as if, that sort of thing, and those things really stick with you. You just sometimes it's the only way in. I remember this is a great one. I remember Rostropovich teaching a class. We were performing in Amsterdam, and he was doing a whole series of classes in The Hague, and we were running down there during the day to see as many of these master classes as we could, and then running back and playing our concert at night. And I remember this one moment where he was trying to get a cellist was playing, I think it was the Schumann concerto, going from this sort of angry passage work to a more friendly, I guess it's this, going into the second theme, I think, if I remember it correctly. And he tried to, he said, make it suddenly a bit friendly here, and the student tried it again, and it was exactly the same. So then he says, reminds me of story, So he tells the story about the public baths in Russia, and the man is a little bit. The man goes to the public bath. He's a little drunk, and he goes in the wrong door, and he goes into the women's side instead of the men's side. And the women, when he walks in, they scream, and when they scream, he drops his towel.
And things get worse.
And they're all like this. But then the man is actually quite good-looking and quite well-endowed, as Mr. Rostropovich said. So the scream suddenly...
Did he put it in those terms?
He did. Suddenly turned to a... Now play it again. And it was perfect. It was exactly like that. So anyway... It's great, isn't it great? I mean,
Yeah.
of course, the Russians are.
great
I mean, they
imagery.
always tell stories about anything. You know,
Well, I think it's,
That reminds me of story.
story.
Story number 7,272,000. You know, but it's great. I mean, and you know, when teaching,
every time you work with them, there's always
and when you're teaching, sometimes you can describe what you want to do. I want you to slow down. I want you to move the bow, you know, away from the bridge a little bit, increase the vibrato as you get soft. I mean, you can go into all these technical things, and sometimes you just say, you know, think about a guy walking into a public bath, and then the women go, not so bad, you know, and that works, you know. It's just all the technical stuff doesn't. That's the whole thing about interpretation.
I've had that experience with coaches who
I thought you were going to say. Well, I thought you were going to
conjure up a visual image.
Yeah.
And it works in terms of...
so you never use that in your analysis? Or
no. Yeah. No, in a different form,
In a different form, right?
Yes,
okay.
yes.
Yeah.
I got the imagery. I was once playing Schumann Piano Quartet, and this was at a festival in Finland, and all the other three members were these, two Russian men and a Yugoslav cellist, and so the violist actually was Yuri Bashmet. And so we're working on the slow movement, you know, and we're talking about the very long line that the violin has, and of course everybody else has it too. And then he comes out, he says, well, line must be like collie with long nose, you know, and then not like boxer with short nose. So I wrote long line, you know. And
I've still got all those stuff written.
Yuri Bashmet's advice, yes. And it was very good, actually, but it had to do with a collie with a long nose.
You know, there's one other thing that I should mention about interpretation and about what an interpreter, performer must take into consideration, and that's the acoustic of a particular hall.
Very good point, yes.
And that also relates to recording, because when you're recording, the microphones are about that far or closer, and then there's other mics that are in the hall. So you have, how often do you sit as close to me if I'm playing as that microphone is? So there are certain things you have to do more. It's interesting. You'd think with I remember Rostropovich again telling us this. He said, when you record, you always have to play a little faster, because of the distance of the microphone. If you play for the hall, you tend to slow things down. When we recorded the Beethoven quartets, we tried to go in the direction of the metronome markings, as crazy as some of them were. We at least went in that direction. When we performed the cycle at Carnegie Hall last year, or whatever it was, for our 30th anniversary, we had to slow everything.
It would not be heard otherwise.
No, and the thing is, if you were sitting in the back of the hall, if you listen to our recording of, say, something like Opus 59, number 3, Last Movement, which we really tried to do at his metronome marking, it's insanely fast. If we did that tempo in Carnegie Hall, it would just sound like a buzzing. You wouldn't even hear anything. So we played what we felt was a really slow tempo. Now, for the listener, especially in the balcony, it would have sounded incredibly fast. So there's that element too. And I know some performers don't change the way they play. They do. This is the way we do it. And
we talk to our students about the need to project. I mean, when you play in a concert hall, I talk to them about having a vocabulary in their bow arm, and that you have to think about the punctuation of the sounds that you're making. And I tell them, because a couple of them have recitals coming up, and so I tell them to envision as if you're speaking in the hall. You would speak more slowly, and you enunciate.
You have to
more.
Articulate.
So that people can understand you and things don't run together. So comparably, they have to do a little bit with not only the physical projection of their sound, but also the articulations that they're making.
Well, it's the way actors have. It's the difference between acting on the stage and acting in front of a camera. I mean, if you gesticulate as much as you do on the stage for a camera, it's going to look ridiculous. That's why there are some actors who are really much better on film, because they can do very subtle things just with their eyes or their face, and subtleties in the voice, but not in terms of projection.
Phil, since you made a reference to tempi in Beethoven quartets, I have a question. I was at a workshop where Opus 131 was studied, and one of the participants compared tempo recordings of the different movements. The opening adagio, 54 beats per minute for the Lindsay Quartet, 80 for the Emerson.
So did we win or lose?
Wait, I don't know. I just want to hear your reaction to it. The Presto, 104 for the Vermeer, 138 for the Emerson.
Oh, well, we definitely won that one.
Actually did.
That's a fast
So
one.
how do you determine, since there was no, on these, no Beethoven metronome?
That's true. The
marking,
late quartets. You didn't.
what to do?
Well, for the opening movement of 131, which is the slow fugue. It is marked adagio, but it is also marked in cut time. Maybe if I heard our recording of it now, I would think it's too fast. But I'd probably, if I heard another recording that was 30 points down from that per quarter note, I would probably think that it starts to feel by the quarter note and not by the half bar. So, you know, sometimes if you play a little bit faster so that you start to feel the bigger beat, the music actually, the pulse of the music actually feels slower. Not always, but that can do that. And so it would be interesting if we had the two recordings here to compare them, but I would be willing to bet you that whatever the quartet was, you said Lindsay, if they were playing 54 to the quarter note and we were playing 80, I would take the chance to bet you that
Your phrasing.
that you would hear in their recording start to feel the quarter note, and even though the music seems to be slower when they play it, after a while, as the movement goes on, you would feel the pulse faster than ours. So it's very tricky where you find that that point where it switches over.
There's often a feeling of naturalness, but I think it also relates to, you know, people's personalities, like how fast your own heart beats and how quick you are in your own reflexes. But really nice example for me of what you're talking about is in Mendelssohn's concerto. For instance, if people play the second movement with, it's written in 6/8, and if you hear it's actually a very fast pulse, and it can move faster but be in 2, so it has a slower pulse, and then you can play more freely if it's you know, so you're not tied down to every beat, and the pulse is much slower, and then you know, more tranquil. But then conversely, the last movement, you hear people play it really, really, really fast, but it sounds like it's in a big 1 rather than 2. So you hear rather than yeah. And so if you play a little slower but really have that precision, then I, you know, and actually it's a slower tempo, you know, in terms of elapsed time, but in terms of energy, there's much more energy to that. So it's sort of an interesting thing that happens sometimes with.
And tempo is probably one of the things that we argue about most and change most, from one night to the next, or just one of us will just, and also where we don't agree, we'll come off the stage and one person will say, "God, that was fast." And we're like, really? You know, I mean, it's amazing. I mean, that's one of the we still don't agree on that. You had a question back. Oh, sorry. I think but she had her hand up before you. So, whoops.
Whoops. I'll take that once. Thank you.
If you
Sorry.
could speak a little bit more about your group decision-making process.
Yeah.
Is there one who's the leader, one who likes to? Well, wait a minute. I have another question. One who wants to focus on historical interpretations of the piece, or the composer, or the storyline, as you say. And then I was wondering if Dr. Nass could speak on successful group decision-making models or things that he has observed that help groups come to consensus. Are there different roles people can play?
Well, the way I answered originally about my changing my approach to interpreting, going from more sort of basically copying what somebody else did that I liked, to really looking at the score and coming up with my own idea. I think that's also been something that's changed for the quartet. the way that we work on something, it's interesting. I mean, it really, in the beginning years, we had a lot of time and no concerts or very few concerts, but we had a lot of time to rehearse. And we used up every minute of that, you know, probably wasting a lot of time. But it was part of the process. I mean, just taking everything apart to the nth degree. I mean, just sort of discussing it's a miracle we survived through those years, because it's just, you know, you just like after a while you go like, can't we just play? But I see this with young groups doing this too, and I'll say, you know, in the amount of time that it took you to decide how you're going to do that at this rehearsal, you could have tried and perfected 10 ways of doing it and been that much better a quartet and that much better a musician. And then you could try all 10 of them, you know, in succession, maybe tape them and listen to them. Of course, that's made a huge difference for us when we started actually recording, but also listening to performances. That's another huge part of interpretation for us is listening. Most of our concerts are recorded now for radio broadcast, and we always get a CD we have to approve it for either one-time local broadcast or if it goes to NPR, and then it's, you know, out there forever. So we have to be a little careful about not only whether we played well enough, but also the sound quality that a particular engineer is doing in a particular hall on that particular night. So we do hear a lot of our own performances and pass the tape around, and that has become, I think, a really important part of our process now, where whoever has listened to that recording of that particular performance will come into the next rehearsal and say, you know, I listened to the recording of Opus 131 last night, and I know it was a big hall and we wanted to slow it down, but I think we've gone too far, and we're taking time. Every 8 measures we're making a retard, and, you know, the music just doesn't have any flow to it anymore, and so we'll make an adjustment with it in that regard. So that's been huge. But in terms of the actual sitting there, you know, battling it out kind of thing, we tend to fight less about a particular point, whoever it is that's either making it or sort of being attacked with it, than just trying it, because unless it's something where you really feel strongly about, and then that person will say, you know, I'm sorry, I really don't feel it that way. And I would say in the 31 years that I've been there, and since it's almost 30, it's going to be in 2009, it'll be 30 years with the same 4 people. I can remember maybe a half dozen times where it went back to the other person, who then said, no, I'm sorry, we've got to try it, we've got to do it this way, or we've got to try it this way at least. Maybe half dozen times. Usually what happens is either someone else will say, okay, well, why don't we try this, which is then a kind of combination of that. And that's for me, that's the most interesting part of it, because often something will come up out of that actually no one was really thinking about, and that ends up being something that we try.
So it becomes a real negotiation. Everybody has veto power, each person.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's something that
which is rarely used. In answer to your question, I think this is part of, you know, we all have heard about quartets who don't talk to each other, who break up. I mean, this is who reach an impasse and can't work out a musical problem. But a lot of these are character issues, and how much each person listens to the other one, not only musically, but about musical ideas, and tries it out. I mean, this is more of what I've heard.
You know, there are two things. You have to, first of all, you have to respect each other. If you're not going to respect the playing and the musicianship, the attempt at artistry of your colleagues, then there's no point. I mean, what's the point? The other thing is that and this has kept us from fighting too much, is that we I think David coined this phrase, but it's a good phrase. We all worship at the same altars.
Huh.
You know, we all admire the same gods of performance, of not just performance, but also composers. But thinking about, you know, we all listen to and admire, you know, the same people. So sometimes, it's interesting, sometimes when things really get sort of impossible and somebody really wants to make their point, they'll pull out from somewhere something that, you know, our teacher Shumsky said, or well, you know, when Rostropovich plays, he, or when Oistrakh played, he never did, or, you know, we kind of bring them into the room, kind of help us out a little bit there. But you had a question, I'm sorry, and I'll get to you in a second.
My question is slightly different. Shouldn't the interpreter pay some attention to the spirit of the music, meaning a lot of these modern recordings of especially the Grosser Fugue and things like that, they pale in comparison to old artists like this Metanac Quartet and days, years ago. And the reason, what I'm trying to say is it all on technique these days, or isn't there anything like an understanding of the person who composed the music, like, you know, whatever he went through?
Absolutely,
right.
Absolutely. No, I mean, I think that's, you know, that's sort of, as they say, the bottom line. You know, that's where it should go to.
How do you go with it? I haven't.
Well, you know, it's interesting. How do you get to that point? And I think there are a number of ways to do that. One, of course, is from all the great training and experiences that you have, hearing those great performances, listening to those great old recordings. When I talk about worshiping at the same altars, I talk about the old style playing, the approach of the groups. I think also that reading about the composer, reading letters of the composer, these things are always extremely helpful. When you've read a lot of Mozart's letters and seen how base his humor was, and I know the whole thing about these two sides, and now there's something recently that I read that they think now that he might have had Asperger's, which is interesting. I have a nephew that has Asperger's, which is kind of interesting if you think about that aspect of his personality. But you know, I think sometimes Mozart, for instance, is treated with such reverence, and of course, I mean, how can you not? But it's like you're afraid to do anything with it because it's so perfect. And yet you read him writing a letter to his mother, for God's sake, you know, talking about shit, basically. I'm sorry, is that we're not on the radio. Yeah, they'll come. Okay. Well, I mean, okay, shice, how's that? That's what he wrote. I mean, that's what he wrote. I read the translation. So. But it's true. I mean, the letters are really pretty.
We have to remember that these are human beings. And
yeah, I mean, yeah. So I mean, that's sort of a silly example.
Yeah.
And you all know this, but it is interesting, you know, when you're looking at a phrase in Mozart, you try to make it perfect, but at the same time, you're right. It has to have the spirit of the music.
Orchestras do much better than string quartets. Is it because the personality of the conductor, one guy saying, I want it interpreted a certain way, or, I mean, is democracy a good thing? That's
Well, as I said, we don't really have one in our group. But, you know, sometimes, I don't know if this is answering your question exactly, but I'm aware of one pitfall in our group that we have to be careful about, which is that sometimes I think we get along too well, and you get to a point where you're too afraid. You don't feel like fighting. You know, it just takes a lot out of you, and I think sometimes if we're not careful, we'll compromise to the point where it starts to be a little bit bland. But then somebody will always hear that and go, I mean, hear a performance of it and say, you know, we've compromised into oblivion. That's another. I've heard somebody. I think Larry said that once, and it's true. You have to be careful. You have to be careful not to compromise your ego to the point where you lose sight of what the composer was really perhaps trying to do. Yeah.
Yes, there's a very well-known picture of the Budapest members of the Budapest String Quartet in Grand Central Station,
Right.
sitting on opposite sides of benches as far as possible. And I wondered whether, because you have such intimate and intense relationship with each other, whether you try to have your personal lives very much apart, and how that works out with the great intimacy and the personal relationships and characters outside of the music.
Well, first of all, that photograph apparently was staged, which I didn't know about for a long time. It's a very famous photograph, and everybody, and I think it really actually did harm to the Budapest's career in a strange way, because people just, oh yeah, the Budapest Quartet, you know, like they didn't speak to each other all those years, and they hated each other, and I mean,
they were the only quartet.
Yeah, I'm sure there were tensions in that group, but it was not to the point where, you know, we do not avoid each other. Only in hotels we try to be separate from each other. More because we just, if somebody wants to rest, you don't want to be hearing somebody practicing next door. And if you don't do that, they'll put you in 4 rooms right next to each other. The other part of it, I think, is that everybody sort of goes his own way, but we often end up, and when we're on tour, we often eat together after a concert. We'll often, all 4 of us, go out unless somebody's too tired. But we don't avoid each other. I mean, Larry Dutton and I, the violist, and I just flew out to Iowa. We happened to be on the same flights. We had 2 hours in between flights, and we sat and had a lovely dinner. The 2 of us, we talked, about a lot of things, not just, actually, we didn't talk about music at all. We talked about the Yankees. We talked about some questions about this workshop that we're going to do, and young quartets, and it was.
So what advice would you give to young quartets, by the way, at this point?
Well, it's tough right now, because there are so many good young players and young groups that want to make it as a quartet. Yeah, it's very hard to know what to say to them, because you want to encourage them. At the same time, it's really...
And it's particularly tough when they're just starting out, because they get very low fees, don't they? I mean, it's a huge investment of time to work up a program, and yet the fees are traditionally
I think it's
very
difficult
low
right now to get a group a group career going like that. And if the group really has something special, and I mean by that not just the way they play, but also their whole package. I mean, if they're interesting people, if their programming is interesting, this is a whole other issue of career that's very important, is how do you develop programming, and what do you do that's innovative in some way, rather than just always playing, an early classical piece, and then a modern piece, and then a big romantic or...
The dinner menu program.
Yeah, I mean, this is the way. This is a classical kind of program, which works. Of course, it can work, but we try to do different things like that, and hear the new piece first, and then go back in time. It's a very different experience.
We have time for one more question, I would say. And so,
the person that I think
who's been waiting longest? Yes. Okay. All right. Your arm's most tired.
Wait, who has the best question?
It's something I've wondered for a very long time, which is how you came to the decision to alternate who would play the first violin part.
Is that your question? That's the most asked question of the Emerson.
And whether the ensemble of the quartet is different depending upon who is doing the first violin part.
Well,
how does it affect the performance? Would it sound significantly different if it was Eugene Drucko or you doing the first violin part?
Yeah, I hope it would sound different. I mean, that's sort of the idea that... Well, Gene and I started this as students. Going back to 1970, I remember that I went up to... At the end of my first year at Juilliard, I was returning a library book, and Gene and I knew each other because we were in Chomsky's class together. And we'd become friends, and we both had been assigned quartets that first year, which never works. And I remember taking this library book back, and I had to do it quickly because I was running to the airport to catch a flight. And so I was doing that, and then I saw Gene over there, and I waved to him, and I said, have a great summer. And he said, oh, I wanted to ask you. And I said, I gotta go quickly. He said, no, quick, let me just ask you quick. I'll call you later, but I was thinking maybe we should try to have a quartet together next year. And I said, yeah, great, sure. And he said, I have some ideas about other people, I'll call you about it. And I said, great, terrific, let's do it. And, I returned the thing, and, thank you very much. And I'm like going out the door of the library, and the door, this is really true, the door is closing like this, and I hear Gene say, we'll switch. I said,
that's great.
That's how it happened. I mean, it was just like, we'll switch, And we basically went against all of the advice all along that said, don't do that. And basically, for us, it was very natural. I mean, that's the way by the time we formed the quartet professionally, it was 6 years we had been playing, switching off already. And it would have been very unnatural, and I don't think it would have worked. I think it would have been very damaging to then say, well, your role is going to have to be this, and your role is going to have to be that, which is what we were advised to do.
Following this up, how do you determine who plays first on which piece?
Way back when, we divided everything up down the middle. Like, you pick what's your favorite Bartók quartet? Okay, you do that one. I'll do this one. Then you pick one, I'll pick one. It was just sort of like, picking the teams for for baseball, for sandlot baseball. I mean, we went through the whole standard repertory that way. It also evolved because the first summer we were asked to play an all Schubert program with the Death and the Maiden and the cello quintet, and we had already been playing Death and the Maiden with Gene playing first in, so it was sort of logical for me to play first.
And you've kept that arrangement
and we've never switched on, because that would sort of defeat the purpose. Then it would become, I mean, look, it's always going to be competitive to some extent, like the stupid critics will always compare us, and then it's like we have to sort of deal with that. And thankfully, the stupid critics have been equally stupid in both directions. It's like, 1 week I'll get wasted, 1 week he'll get wasted. So it hasn't created too much trouble. But yeah, it just basically nobody's an expert in one thing. But if we started switching, I mean, it's something that's come up. Like, should we maybe the next time we do a Beethoven cycle switch on the violin part? But then I would be playing. I'd be walking out on the stage playing for the first time the first violin part of Opus 59-3 with Gene sitting there, who's played it 500 times and recorded it. How am I going to feel doing that, and vice versa? I mean, and then it's going to bring up all this potential for comparison, which is exactly what we were trying to avoid. So I think it's probably better we don't go there. But to answer your question, the quartet would definitely sound better with me playing first. Just ask Gene.
When's your next appearance in New York, the quartet? For all your fans.
I guess mostly Mozart. Well, we'll be in Tanglewood and Carrymore this summer, doing all 3 Brahms quartets on each of those concerts in July, and then we'll be at mostly Mozart in August, playing with Jeffrey Kahane, pianist.
Oh, wonderful!
Schubert, Mozart, Hans, and we're doing the Kaija Saariaho, the Finnish composer, is going to be in residence at the mostly Mozart, which is a kind of new thing they're trying this summer. Great. So we're doing the piece that she wrote for us that we premiered at Carnegie in our series there. We're doing in the middle of that.
Wonderful.
So.
I think we have to close. So
anyway.
Join us in thanking Barton.
Further information about our programs and a complete archive of past Philip Setzer events is available at philipsetzer.org.